Hello and welcome to Season 2 of So Now What with Gates Cambridge, a podcast tackling some of the world's wicked problems with those dedicated to doing something about them. I'm Catherine Galloway and my guests, as always, are Gates Cambridge scholars working to make an impact in the lives of others. But what if work itself is not working well? What if business as usual is leaving an unusually, unacceptably large number of people out? As companies, governments and stock markets globally scramble to adjust to sweeping new trade tariffs from the desk of America's businessman-in-chief, there's much talk right now of a new world era, one of protectionism, supply chain nightmares and employment shocks. But what if space also opened up for alternative business models to thrive? Sustainable, scalable, equitable, nimble and local, working better, smarter for people and planet alike. Given the current chaos, it feels like it's worth a serious shot, and the B Corps, the social entrepreneurs, the startups and the community-led collectives are right here already to help us adjust our aim. So how do we encourage enterprise for the common good and scale it from a nice-to-have to everyone's new normal? This month, I have the great pleasure of sitting down with my guests in person. So a very warm welcome to Paolo Savaget, Gates Cambridge class of 2015, Sandile Mtetwa, who arrived here as a Gates Cambridge scholar just 2 years after Paolo in 2017, and Uche Ogechukwu, who has only been with us since September, part of the most recent Gates Cambridge cohort in 2024. What a treat to all be sitting across from each other in real life today. Thank you all very much for making that possible.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
We're in a recording studio at West Hub, right in the middle of the university's new innovation district in West Cambridge, which seems to be the perfect place to be talking about all things collaborative, disruptive and inventive. Paolo, you're an academic with a foot in both engineering and entrepreneurship, and your research happy place is where, in your words, resources are scarce, stakes are high, and time is short. Your recent book, The Four Workarounds, How the World's Scrappiest Organisations Tackle Complex Problems, argues that massive wins can be achieved with minimal resources, as long as we're prepared to work outside the status quo and value the easy, smart, and quick solutions right in front of us. That work has taken you around the world, from your native Brazil to Germany, the UK and beyond, tracking down examples of truly innovative thinking that lead to more inclusive societies. And Sandile, your eye is firmly fixed on a future where energy supply is both inclusive and equitable, allowing all kinds of enterprise to flourish. Growing up in Zimbabwe, where power cuts were frequent and clean, green energy almost unheard of, your Cambridge PhD in chemistry saw you focusing on how to produce and store hydrogen effectively so that your own country and others could move away from reliance on fossil fuels. You now work at the Centre for Global Equality at the University of Cambridge, supporting investment in sustainable energy, transport and climate solutions across the global south. And at the same time, you continue to empower the community at home through your social enterprise, the Samuka Arise initiative, which has now helped hundreds of Zimbabwe's most disadvantaged girls and young women to flourish socially, economically and academically. And Uche, the solar energy company Green Age Technologies that you founded with 4 friends at the University of Nigeria in 2018, has so far attracted over $5.6 million in investment, thanks to your determination to keep the whole operation as close to the source as possible. Your engineering and technology systems are designed, built, installed and maintained easily by the same local people who are using the power. As you say with Green Age, we're not just lighting up buildings, we're empowering lives and fostering economic growth. And you've doubled down on that commitment by supporting other African entrepreneurs through your Hardware Garage initiative in Nigeria and your African Founders webinars here in Cambridge. All this has brought you a Gates Cambridge Impact Prize earlier this year, and in your spare time, Uche, you're doing an MPhil in Technology Policy at the Cambridge Judge Business School. Now, I think I could just plug all 3 of you into the national grid and the UK could keep the lights on for quite a long time. But however brilliant your own ideas and achievements are, the focus here is how we get more people on board doing more business this way for the greater good. So what have you brought to the table today that will help us switch on to or work around that problem? Paolo, let's start with you.
I'm very interested in resourceful ways of approaching systems change. And as you started earlier, the podcast, you mentioned how we're living in complex times with budget cuts, for example. And I think that more than ever, we need to think unconventionally and find resourceful ways of addressing our most pressing problems.
Thank you. What about you, Sandile? What have you brought us?
So I offer a new approach to tackling energy poverty, and I think this can be done through inclusive innovation. To truly address challenges in communities, I think we must understand and respond to their needs directly, integrating them in solutions that we create. And I think this tends to outgo outdated systems that often continue inequalities.
So a fresh way of thinking, okay. And Uche, what about you?
Asking myself, how do I connect 30 million people in Africa to, sustainable clean energy? And this time, not just connecting them, but helping them leverage what they can build, and also introducing new technologies that are not existing, but this time, like peer-to-peer energy sharing, decentralizing financing for the common people, and then also making them be like the manpower to sustain it. Because I feel imported technologies hasn't helped almost any nation, and I think it's time for Africa. So, yeah.
That's wonderful, opening a new horizon and a completely different way of thinking about this sector in particular. Uche, if we could continue with you, you were so young when you started Green Age Technologies, just during your third year at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka, where you were studying geography. Mm-hmm. I get the sense that your generation really get it in terms of what good business means as entrepreneurs and as consumers. What did you most need as a young entrepreneur? What do young entrepreneurs in this space most need to scale and to get flying?
I think what helped us, and that is what Cambridge has been very good at, is to provide that ecosystem where people can just sit down and think. So as a young guy in Nigeria, I tell people all the time we applied for let's say startup event, we never won. We're not even selected for the first or second. They always throw us out, basically because maybe they don't like our innovation, or they think our innovation is strong enough. Someone specifically said, hey, Uche, people cannot produce this. You can't do it. So it was like our thoughts were even beyond the judges. They felt it was impossible. Until we met few people who were outside the ecosystem, but were also thinking about innovation. And I remember the words of one of the professors who brought his personal money and invested in our startup.
Wow.
He said he wants to invest in where he cannot sleep at night, where he will keep thinking, where did my money go to? And I so much appreciate him and all my co-founders, because the same person reinvested in our startup after a while, because he came back and said, you guys were worth my investment.
So what you're actually talking about is an enabling environment and people to back potential to get you going.
An enabling environment and a resilient founder or person, because sometimes that enabling environment might not even serve to your purpose. They might not listen to you like they didn't listen to me, but someone else would always listen to you.
And I know that you're trying to provide that for other African founders as well.
Exactly why we started the Hardware Garage, exactly the same reason we started the eLab African Founders Program, because as someone who has spent a lot of time off the African continent, I knew how difficult it is for someone to just blend into this academic rigor and trying to start something in a foreign country. So I knew, even though Cambridge provided a lot of facilities, but not to be biased, I know lots of the mentors were going to be whites, lots of the judges were going to be whites. They wouldn't understand that someone in Africa might not just stay in a place there was no light for a whole day. Maybe it's just the grid. No, it's not the grid. There is no light. This place is just that way. So when I understood that fact, I felt the right thing to do was, why not set something? And kudos to Kamia, a fellow guest scholar. He gave me that platform to set up the African Founders Program. We've done 4 series, and next time we want to do 2 masterclasses to support more African founders or even people thinking about going into entrepreneurship.
Wow, I'd love to sit in on that. Do let me know when it's happening.
Sure.
Sandile, on our prep call before this podcast, you described yourself as an ally in terms of sustainable energy and climate work. And again, this idea of helping us all to rise together. And of course, you're also a crucial ally for the girls that you work with through the Simuka Arise initiative. What does allyship really look like for you in practice in this business in particular?
Allyship is really about co-creation, allowing people to feel that they are part of the cause, part of the solution, right? And the truth is, co-creation is not easy, because when we're looking at dealing with communities or people, we are not just looking at the innovation part of it. We are looking at a lot of barriers, cultural, social, economic, right? And I think that's why a lot of organizations really don't want to go that route. Because the truth is, it is tedious, it is long, and
Resource consuming as well.
resource consuming, exactly. But in my way of thinking, it's really about sustainability. It's better to have slow but good progress and good outcomes than to have very fast outputs that are not sustainable. So really, we need to build a sense of ownership in communities and people that spark an idea in them, be an ally, listen to them, allow them to take ownership, allow them to take control. And to be honest, I think sustainability becomes something that's just natural and instinctive to them. So I think allyship is really about instilling that sense of purpose in people.
So sustainability, not just climate sustainability, not just sort of the eco understanding of that, but it's the longevity of a project, the fact that it's owned, developed and cherished by the people who use it. Both of you have really
That's right.
pushed that button.
Yep.
Sandile, you're talking about long-term, deep thinking. And Paolo, sometimes your work talks about fast, quick and dirty workarounds, as you call it. I've been struck so recently that there's an astonishing blind spot at best and arrogance at worst in the developed world, that enterprise and business actually means our way of doing enterprise and business. And the minute you look further afield, which you do in your book, you find what you're calling scrappy organisations, resource poor, as you call feisty, resourceful, and operating on the fringes of power, which I love, using one or more flavours of your 4 workarounds. First of all, tell us what the workarounds are in a nutshell. And secondly, what can these organisations teach us in terms of working for the greatest good of the greatest number?
Sure, yeah. A workaround is usually an unconventional way of approaching a problem by, instead of following the default approach of trying to tackle the obstacles that we all face, we work around them. And I think that we all work around obstacles in our lives, even if we don't necessarily pay attention to them. And my effort was to show how we can do that more intentionally. How can you find these opportunities? Roughly speaking, a piggyback is when you work around an obstacle by leveraging different relationships, pairings that have not been matched before, or crisscrossing systems. And the other workarounds use different attributes. This, while piggyback is about relationships, roughly speaking, the loophole is about rules. The one I call the roundabout is about self-reinforcing behaviors. And the next best is about resources. It's so difficult to know what the future looks like. And when you work around a tough obstacle, you find an accessible way to make change and to bring people on board and to create a track record, right? And to find new pathways to scale. So that's how I usually think of workarounds. And I developed this by studying computer hackers, right? Hacking into computer systems, complex systems to make change.
That's a shadowy line of work that not many of us have really thought much about. But you realise that the way that computer hackers work, the hacking model, could actually be applied in our workplaces, whether or not we own our own company, whether or not we're a CEO. So how do we develop a hacking mentality? What's that?
A hacker embraces complexity. They don't try to organize everything and tame complexity. They just welcome that, and they know that they don't know everything, and they don't have to know everything when they get started. But they find ingenious ways to work around the obstacles that bar them from having access. I really like the name of the most notorious hack is Trojan horse. And ultimately the idea there is that if you try to break the walls or the gates of a very well-protected city, you're not going to find a way in. But if you find an ingenious workaround, in that case the wooden horse, you may be brought in by the people who have more control of that system.
That was one of the huge strengths of our hardware garage. We called it the 8 weeks route to MVP. So we believe that to innovate or think, about new products, you actually don't need to sit down and build something that has not existed before. Sometimes you need to look at what has existed, and you can actually see a solution to the problem. By bringing all the stakeholders together to think, we were able to develop new products. In fact, ideas about the Ubuntu energy started coming out when we were building projects for other people, trying to build projects for a hospital, and they needed maybe downtime for another facility. And we're like, how do you send power to this place? How do you manage this? How do you manage that? And quickly you could just ideate and get one simple product that could become something big.
And as you were saying, Sandile, that also allows you to own the solution very quickly. In terms of common good, women and girls that you're helping with the Samuka Arise initiative, they're the demographic that is crying out more than almost any other for help to flourish. What are the things that are of the most value to them? What are the solutions they're asking for from you? And how do you make that happen?
Energy poverty is something that I think statistically affects women and girls more. We are looking at a lot of communities in Africa using biomass. They need to fetch firewood. They need to cook, and sometimes the power that you get from firewood takes you so many hours to cook somewhat simple meals. That means girls are missing out on education. They're also missing out on other economic opportunities because they spend so much time trying to take care of the home. So it is such a disservice to not include women and girls in the discourse of energy, right? And so I think one thing that I try to integrate whenever I do workshops or projects in Zimbabwe is women and girls are key among the stakeholders that need to voice their opinion about the kind of energy requirements that they need. A lot of it centers on clean energy, right? Because firewood is known to cause respiratory issues, especially when you have to use a hut and it's enclosed. And also it needs to be something that's simple to use for them and quick. So really what girls and women are crying out for is, can we have technologies that allow us to spend more time for productivity, right? Allow us to also not have to suffer health issues. Allow us to also have to focus on ourselves. Yeah. So I think the crucial thing is we need to center a lot of energy on marginalized groups in general. We're not just talking about women and girls, we're also talking about people with disabilities, the youth, people of old age. But I really think it's when we are trying to humanize the idea of energy, we need to make sure that people who are affected the most are at the center of the solutions that we're creating.
I'm really hoping that you and Uche are going to leave this studio and go and, as he would say, ideate about how we can fix that.
For me also, it's not just about bringing, trying to create a solution that is women inclusive, but also adding women to the development itself, making women part of the initiators or innovators.
Yes, absolutely.
So in our lab, our most successful startup is led by a female. And because she came with this gender lens, she knew exactly what the women wanted.
Yeah.
She knew where they were, and she just went for them. Our job was to develop what she was thinking about. We all ideated around her problem. And as we speak, I think she has gotten $350,000 funding from RioJAP, and that's ECOWAS and the World Bank. Just spending about 18 months in our lab. So my point is not just trying to create for them, but also making them create. And that has played a huge role in some of the products we have developed at the garage.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, and I think just to add on to what Uche said, I agree. I think the idea of co-creating is really listening to what they need. If they want to be in that position of, I want to be the creator, allow them to be the creators. If they want to be in a position of, I want to be the beneficiary, allow them to be that. But we work in both ends, and I think, yeah. So I think drawing on from being a chemist as well, whenever we are forming reactions, we always deal with the limiting reagent, and that's why marginalized communities are important. Whenever we're creating anything, it needs to be based on people who are served the least, not who are served the most. Because when we look at those who are served the least, we tend to create very inclusive, equitable solutions that benefit everyone.
Thank you, Sandile. Paolo, one thing you might not know, but which I came to know during my research for this podcast, is that we have both interviewed Simon and Jane Berry, who started Cola Life.
Oh, wow. I had no idea you had interviewed them.
Yeah, in 2013. So Cola Life is a classic example of using, going to a community, seeing a need. In your case, you're calling it an example of piggyback workaround.
Exactly, yeah. It's an organization, a very small organization, or as I call a scrappy organization, that the founders had lived in rural Zambia for some years, and they got a bit puzzled that you could find Coca-Cola everywhere, but you cannot find life-saving medicines, like for diarrhea treatment, for example, that people living in extreme poverty could afford, right? It's over-the-counter, there's no overdosage, it doesn't require refrigeration. So in theory, it should be available if there's a demand, but there's no offering, they cannot find. And then the workaround that they implemented was to literally piggyback on Coca-Cola's distribution chain at first, feeding medicines between bottles in a Coca-Cola crate to take a free ride to these regions where the medicine could not be found, and then expanding the intervention to understand that the reason why Coca-Cola is found everywhere is because there's an entire ecosystem that allows that to happen. And Uche mentioned ecosystems before. It's that approach. It's understanding that there are many actors that are interconnected that allow for the flow of that product to remote regions. And they use pretty much the same ecosystem. They repurpose that ecosystem that already exists to offer access to that medicine. And the uptake increased massively. It was a very cheap intervention. Within a few years, 4, 5, 6 years, it increased the uptake of the medicine from less than 1% to about 50% in many intervention areas.
But the genius is that not only was the packaging designed to fit in between the Coca-Cola bottles on a crate and to get to the last mile, that tiny little shop in the middle of nowhere with no power, but also the packaging was exactly the right size to get the correct dosage of medicine, and it was used as a cup afterwards. It is so brilliant.
It's amazing design, and I think that from a systems perspective, what I find really fascinating about that case is because, one, it teaches us that most organizations are trying to tackle the problem by removing the obstacles. So they're going to improve infrastructure, they're going to improve logistics, they're going to try to do the things that they think prevent the medicine from being found. And of course, that's very important, but it will take a lot of money and time. right? And there's already so much there. There's abundance in these places, right? If you just look through the lenses of scarcity, you're not going to see that there are many things that are already found. And with that approach, they could see that fast-moving consumer goods is very resilient, very effective. Why can't we leverage what is already there, right? But crisscrossing the systems.
But to your point, Sandile, what they also did that was fantastic was, first of all, offer it for free. They made themselves redundant, the founders, Simon and Jane Berry. They said, we're not going to be here forever. So what will permit this community to take this on and own this product themselves? So they offered it to a local pharmaceutical company to put the kits together. They spoke to the mothers to say, what do you need for this to work? And they said, well, we need an effective way of measuring the dosage, others it simply won't work. So they brought everybody on board and then stepped back. And that seemed to me such a neat, beautiful way of working.
And I smiled when Sandile used the chemical analogy to describe collaboration and different ways of making change, because I wrote a paper on this case that we use the analogy of describing them as a catalyst.
Right.
Because the idea is that they're not part of the solution, but they helped the solution be formed and sustained. Yeah. And it was exactly as you said, they made themselves gradually more unnecessary in that ecosystem so that they could step away without being noticed.
Yeah.
They made themselves invisible throughout time and leaving a self-sustaining legacy. And this is such an important model in development, right? Because we constantly see development agencies being criticized for funding a program for 5 years and output are amazing, right? Like everything works perfectly for 5 years. When the funding is gone, everything collapses and it leaves a legacy of dependency instead of autonomy.
Yeah. And I think I just want to add to that. Continued aid robs people of their agency. I think for a start, it's great. You can help people to jumpstart, to help them start initiatives. But I think when aid goes on for 20 or so odd years, I think there's a problem there. We need to allow people to then take up the initiative, sustain it themselves. And I think that it grows better that way.
So if we take aid off the table and we put enterprise for the common good the table, that becomes immediately more self-sustaining and effective. What I'm struck by with all of you is the fact that you're all interdisciplinary thinkers, and you all step outside your boundaries. Tell me how you see interdisciplinary thinking, if you can, as a way that we can scale this idea of enterprise for the common good. Why is it so important?
Should I start?
Yeah, go.
So I grew up in my father's factory. My father does polyethylene and recycling. And I understood from his factory how systems work, how production works. So when I see things first, I see them in systems, in operations. And then when I went to the university, studied geography, I started seeing issues in climate. When I decided to solve the problem of power, which my father was having, I and my co-founders began a startup. So when I preach clean energy most times, I preach it from both the solution and the problem. And it makes me understand what actually the person listening to me is trying to say. Like Sandile said, it's not just having those people participate in it, but also having both the source and the destination inclusive. That's what I think interdisciplinarily brings to entrepreneurship.
Brilliant. What about you, Sandile? How do you think of yourself as an interdisciplinary thinker? What's the secret sauce?
I think one thing that I see as important, especially for innovators who come from technology, scientific backgrounds, is to understand that it's not just the technology that matters. We've seen so many stories of people building the best, technology that exists out there. But when you put it in a community, it maybe lasts 1 or 2 years and people just forgo it and forget about it. That's because people are complex. People have different things that are going on in their day-to-day lives. And I think the best way to embed any new innovation, any enterprise, is to understand the ways of living that people have. And that's really social aspects to it, right? So as a scientist, I'm not a social scientist person, sociologist, but I need to understand it from that view. Cultural things, traditional, especially in African contexts, so many of those things are very powerful in how people live, religion, all of that. I mean, one person can't possibly know all these facets, but you do learn as you start working in some of these areas, how each of those things affect how technologies are rolled out, how innovation can be progressed, and how it can be made more sustainable. So it's really just, that's how people live. No one is just one tiny bit of anything. People are diverse, so we need to understand that.
Paolo, I'm going to come to you with the same question about interdisciplinarity, but with a lens specifically on business school, because that's where you work, and you've got a double appointment that is both at the Said Business School and at the engineering department. I wondered, what one hack could any business school do tomorrow that would change and enlarge their perception of social enterprise and what good business means?
That's a very tough question. I would say that I'm not only interdisciplinary, but I have a very strong disrespect for disciplinary boundaries.
Love it.
I think they are arbitrary and they make us numb to alternatives. So, and perhaps the best metaphor I can use is that disciplines give us different lenses. I think we have to combine these different tools because we see things differently and we can approach our problems differently. That's as simple as that, right? And I think that business schools are becoming quite rigid, especially in terms of publications. They are becoming very templated. There are lists of publications that are accepted and others that are not. And I think that while some of these journals, for example, are accepting of interdisciplinary approaches, still they have a very strong perspective on how you approach the problems and how you're going to interpret these problems and solutions, right? So I'm one of the people that tries to push for change in that. And I think that having a joint appointment between engineering and business, like and you asked specifically about the contributions to business, I think engineering has a very strong focus on making things work and see how things work. They don't necessarily problematize that much. They don't necessarily think that they have to solve every problem in the world, but they're very interested in mechanisms, in processes. And I think that that's quite powerful as means of understanding businesses and seeing how businesses can do differently and can engage with problems in different ways.
Paolo, I'm seeing you as an academic hacker right now. I love it. What we've really been talking about, I think, over the last half hour has been alternative forms of power and power sharing in actual power, as in keeping the lights on, but also who owns any social enterprise, who owns a solution. One thing I've learned just from listening to you is that you don't have to be an overtly social enterprise. You don't have to say, I'm a B Corp, or wait until you're the CEO of your own company before you can start to work towards a bigger focus on a common good. And so that to me has been really inspiring because it's like start now, start dirty, start scrappy, start where you are. Could you finish off today by giving us a so now what? How can we help you scale what you're doing, and also how can we help ourselves to be a bit more like you?
All right, so firstly, I want to give a big shout out to Lara, Alan, and Alex, who work at the Center of Global Equality, because they are championing what I think is the what next, and that's inclusive innovation. I think we really need to amplify this idea of co-creating solutions and making sure that we place a lot of emphasis on the time that takes and also the effort that takes. I think that we need to humanize innovation. We also need to support local manufacturing. I think that's how we build real agency, true ownership, and also lasting impact. We need to keep pushing for change that starts with people and stays with people.
That's amazing. Thank you, Sandile. What about you, Uche? What would you like to say?
It might be so surprising to anyone, that we began the hardware garage when we had no money. Decided to start funding it from our purse, even as a startup that was still trying to grow. And our goal when we set it up was to support young people to come and innovate. Because in the part of the country where we were from, it was like, how did you do it? And trying to tell them how we do it was difficult. So we opened our spaces up for them and said, come use our machines, use anything, just let us know. We will try to get a dedicated staff to support anyone. But we also discovered that, like you mentioned, start anyhow, more like start small. So that frugal part became an issue because they used lots of our resources that we couldn't control. And then I and my co-founders, we spoke, and I was like, let's just set up a garage. And then when we see people who have something amazing, let's fund them to bootstrap. And they were like, it's wonderful. So we began it. We made a call, the first call in Southeast Nigeria for hardware technology innovators. We got about 89 innovators come for the event. So many people applied, but someone was willing to pay for 89 people to have an accommodation, feed, and display their innovation. It's on YouTube. If you type Enugu Tech Fed, it's 2019, you would see it. You would see that it was not far from when we started our company. And till now, we've been funding the garage with our money. So before we started, I think I told one of you that I think we're going to close the garage.
No, you need an investor.
I think so. We need that, but we don't know where to get that. We've not, since we started, because I don't know how, to be very frank, how people fund social innovation. Because like she said, it's very hard. She mentioned something about patience. It requires patience capital. So if maybe after now we see an investor that is able to provide, even if it's like $500,000, that will enable us build 10 more startups.
Wow.
Because we built 2 startups without any funding. And all of them have raised close to about $450,000 in total. And then we've supported others who would not invest directly, but provided them with like raw material support or process support. And they went on to raise money. And part of my goal when I started was that I said, we want to connect 30 million Africans to clean energy. We can't do that alone as Greenwich. We need people. We need to develop more companies. We need to build more capacities. And that starts with supporting these people to think on their own.
Do you know what, Uche? That's the first direct ask, such a clear ask that we've ever had on So Now What? And I hope that someone in the Gates community or beyond is listening to that and saying we can't let the hardware garage go. So that's a So Now What? Very, very directly there.
That'd be so nice.
Get in touch with Uche. Okay, and Paolo, what's your So Now What to take us home?
I would like to value diversity and also being adaptive, promoting adaptive approaches. And the rationale for that, I think it touches on how you started the podcast. You used the term wicked problems instead of just a challenge, right? And I don't think we live in a world in which there are challenges that we can easily target and fix, right? Because the challenges change and they are interconnected as well. You start working on biomass and then suddenly there's waste and then there's gender and then there's like inequalities, right? And and no one alone will be able to address everything. And very often the things we do will create unintended consequences that are negative. But we need to be able to approach these very complex problems from diverse ways, right? We need different people approaching different facets of these very complex problems. And we have to be adaptive because the problems change as well. The ways we understand the problems change, right? And we need diversity, we need adaptation so that we can do that in an evolving way.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, all three of you, because you've given so much food for thought in this episode. A huge thanks to all of you for coming. Paolo Savaget, you're the Associate Professor of Engineering Entrepreneurship at the Said Business School and the Department of Engineering Science at the University of Oxford, as well as author of that must-read for scrappy dreamers and doers everywhere, The 4 Workarounds. My thanks too to Sandile Mtetwa, the Country Partnerships Coordinator at the Centre for Global Equality here in Cambridge and the founder of the Simuka Arise initiative. Do check that out. Improving life and opportunities for girls and young women in Zimbabwe. And Uche Ogechukwu, current Gates Scholar, completing his MPhil in Technology Policy at the Cambridge Judge Business School, whilst also the co-founder and director of solar energy startup Green Age Technologies in Nigeria. I can tell you there's been a lot of energy in the studio today, of the very best kind, and it's been a true pleasure to hear you unpack your illuminating ideas on transforming how we do business, but also on how we could all do life a little bit better as well. My thanks too to producers Mandy Garner from Gates Cambridge, Nick Saffel from the Central Communications Office at the University of Cambridge, and to the lovely team at West Hub who've been hosting us today. And of course, thanks to all of you for listening and for sharing your responses and ideas with us in the comments. I'm Catherine Galloway. This was So Now What with Gates Cambridge. Join us again next time for another wicked problem dissected by those determined to do something about it.